Delia Marsh had lived in Harrow Flat long enough to know the difference between a man waiting for news and a man waiting for permission. Everett Crail was waiting for permission. She watched him from behind the post office counter on a Tuesday morning in September. The kind of morning where the sky over Wyoming was so blue, it almost looked cold, even with the sun sitting full and warm above the ridge. He had come in at his usual hour, said his usual nothing, and taken the envelope she held out without glancing at the return address, the way most people did. Instead, he turned it over, looked at the back, and stood there for a count of about 15 seconds that felt considerably longer than 15 seconds. Then he put it in his shirt pocket without opening it. Then he left without buying the fence nails he had come in to buy. Delia watched the door settle shut behind him. In 31 years of running this counter, she had seen people receive letters announcing deaths, letters announcing fortunes, letters announcing the end of marriages and the beginning of wars, and the arrival of grandchildren they hadn't known were coming. She had seen men cry over envelopes they held for 10 minutes before opening. She had seen women read the same page 4 times in a row without changing expression. She had not often seen a man look at the outside of a letter and then decide the inside could wait. She turned back to her sorting and thought about it for a while. Everett Crail was 33 years old and had been running the Crail spread on the eastern slope above Harrow Flat since before his father died, and his younger brother Theo was old enough to be useful, but not old enough to be reliable. He was not a complicated man, or at least he did not give the impression of being one. He was tall in the way that tall men from working families tend to be, not elegant about it, just long through the bone, slightly stooped across the shoulders from years of ducking under things built for someone shorter. His face was weathered in the way that Wyoming weather made faces weathered, which was to say, completely and without apology. And he had brown eyes that paid close attention to whatever they were aimed at. He had been married to a woman named Ruth Hadley for 7 years, before she died of typhoid fever in the winter of 1885. That was 4 years ago now. Delia remembered Ruth as a capable woman with a low laugh and no patience for sentimentality, which had made her and Everett well matched in a way that was plain to see if you spent 5 minutes watching them in the same room. Ruth had died in January. By March, Everett was back to work, not because he had recovered. Delia understood enough about grief to know you didn't recover from that kind of loss in 6 weeks. But because the cattle didn't know his wife had died and the fence didn't care, and the work was still there, regardless. He had become quieter after, not unfriendly, just quieter in the way of a man who had decided somewhere in the first winter alone that most things didn't need to be said out loud. Delia was the one who had set the mail-order bride advertisement on his counter 3 months ago. She had folded it flat so it looked like something official, and watched his face when he unfolded it and saw what it actually was. He had looked at it for a long moment. Then he had looked at her. "What exactly are you trying to do, Delia?" "I'm trying to make sure you have someone sitting across the table from you at dinner." He had looked back at the paper. She could not read what was on his face, except that it was not the dismissal she had been prepared for. He picked up the paper, folded it again along the same crease, and put it in his coat pocket. He did not say thank you. He did not say anything. He bought his coffee and his tobacco, and a length of the cotton rope he always seemed to be running short of, and he left. She hadn't expected much to come of it. That had been 3 months ago. This was the third envelope from the correspondence service. That evening, Everett sat at the kitchen table after Theo had gone to bed, with the envelope on the wood in front of him, and a lamp turned low to the left. The house was quiet except for the wind which was always present on the eastern slope and which he had long since stopped hearing as a sound and started hearing as a kind of baseline silence. The first 2 letters had come from women he knew nothing about and felt nothing toward. He had read them with the careful attention he gave to everything: inventories, land surveys, weather patterns, and had found them to be precisely what they were: descriptions of strangers. The first woman was in Missouri and had written warmly about her family and her church and her hope for a peaceful life in a growing country. The second was in Kansas and had listed her qualities the way you might list the features of a horse at auction. He had written back to neither of them, not out of cruelty, but because he could not think of what to say. He could not find in either letter anything he recognized. He opened the third one now. The handwriting was different from the first 2, more deliberate. The letters were formed carefully, each one finished before the next began, with no slant to the right or left. The hand of someone who had taught themselves to write, and then practiced, until the habit settled into something like precision. He began reading. "I will not describe my appearance because I do not know what you are looking for, and I refuse to adjust myself to fit a picture I haven't seen. What I can tell you instead, which may be more practical: I know accounting. I am not afraid of cold. I can be quiet for many hours if the situation calls for it. I have one question for you. Are you a man who needs to be talked to, or a man who needs someone to sit quietly alongside him? The answer will tell me more than any description of your land or your habits." Everett read that paragraph a second time. Then he put the letter face down on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the dark for a while. He picked it back up. She had written about herself in the way that a careful person edits themselves not from dishonesty but from the habit of measuring what is necessary before speaking. She was 31 years old, she said, and had lived in Cincinnati, and had worked in the printing trade for 12 years as an accountant for small operations that could not afford an office of their own. She did not say what had brought her to this particular decision. She said she was not afraid of hard work or hard weather. She said she had specific questions she would ask in a subsequent letter if he chose to respond, and that he should not feel obligated. That last line interested him. Most people in his experience said things like that in order to apply a kind of pressure that went in the opposite direction. She had written it as though she meant it flatly. He turned the envelope over to look at the return address again. C. Voss, Cincinnati, Ohio. And then he noticed the thing he had noticed in the post office without consciously registering it, the thing that had made him put the letter in his pocket without opening it right there at the counter. The handwriting on the outside of the envelope was not the same as the handwriting inside. The outside address was written in a different hand rounder, with a slight rightward tilt the V in Voss left open at the top. For a moment he sat with a feeling that was not quite recognition and not quite memory, but something that lived in the territory between the two. Ruth had written her letters that way. The open V, the rightward tilt. He sat with that for a long time, He did not know what to do with it, and he was honest enough with himself to know that he might be looking for a resemblance that wasn't there. The way a man lost in the dark will convince himself that a shape in the distance is what he most wants it to be. He folded the letter carefully along its original creases and placed it in the wooden box he kept under the edge of his bed, a small pine box that had belonged to his father, and that he now used without having made a conscious decision about it, for things he didn't know how to categorize. Ruth's last letter to her sister, which had been returned unopened because the sister had already moved, a bill of sale for the first horse he had ever owned outright, a photograph of his parents taken in 1871 that he never looked at but could not bring himself to discard. He put the lamp out and lay in the dark with the wind moving around the corners of the house. He did not sleep for a long time. It took him 4 days to write back. Not because he didn't know what to say exactly. It was more that he had not in his adult life made a practice of being honest with people he didn't know. With people he knew, honesty was simpler. They already understood the context, and he could leave out the parts that context made obvious. With a stranger, nothing was obvious. And he was not willing to write the kind of letter that said nothing in a friendly way, which seemed to him a waste of time for both parties. He sat down at the kitchen table on the 4th evening with the lamp on and a clean sheet of paper and a pen that needed dipping more often than he'd have liked. He wrote his name, his age, the size of his land, a sentence about the water situation in late summer. Then he stopped. That was inventory. That wasn't what she had asked. He thought about her question. Are you a man who needs to be talked to or a man who needs someone to sit quietly alongside him, he wrote. I am a man who needs someone to sit quietly alongside him. But I have found since my wife died 4 years ago that I sometimes also need to be reminded that someone is there. I am not certain I can explain the difference between those two things. I am not certain there is a difference. If that is not a problem, I am willing to keep writing. He read it back. It was more honest than he had intended. He considered crossing out the part about Ruth, then decided that if he was going to do this at all, he was going to do it without removing the things that were actually true. He sealed the envelope before he could change his mind. Her reply came 18 days later. She had written back faster than he expected, which told him something, though he wasn't sure what. She did not address what he had said about Ruth. Instead, she asked, "How many acres is there water year-round? Do you drink? Do you gamble? Are you quick with your temper?" And at the end, as though it had almost been left out, would you object to a wife who kept her own opinions? He laughed out loud at that one. He was alone in the kitchen at the time, and the sounds surprised him, low and sudden and real in a way that sounds in empty houses seldom were. He wrote back that the land was 640 acres and ran up against the eastern slope of a ridge that had no name on any map he had seen, that the water from the main creek was reliable 11 months out of 12, and the well had never gone dry in 7 years, that he drank occasionally, and never before noon, that he had gambled twice in his life and lost both times, and considered that sufficient education on the subject, and that his temper was slow to arrive and fast to leave, except in cases of deliberate cruelty which he did not tolerate. As for opinions, he wrote, I have a sufficient supply of my own. A house might be improved by a second set. He sealed that one too a little faster. The letters settled into a rhythm after that. Every 2 weeks, sometimes closer to 10 days, she wrote with the same careful economy she had shown from the beginning. Short sentences, no decoration. The occasional observation that arrived sideways and landed harder than the direct approach would have. In her third letter, she mentioned without explaining why that she had worked for 7 different printing operations over 12 years, and that the last one had closed 18 months ago, and that she had spent the time since then in various forms of what she called transitional employment, which he understood to mean the kind of work a capable person takes when they are waiting for something steadier to appear. She asked almost as an afterthought whether the land was in his name, and had been for some time. He noticed the way she had phrased it. Not out of avarice, she added immediately, but because she needed to know whether the ground he was offering to stand on was actually solid. The careful addition interested him. It was the addition of someone who was used to being misread. He wrote back that the land had been in his name since 1882. He didn't ask why she wanted to know. In her fourth letter, she asked him what he was most afraid of. He sat with that question for 3 days before writing back drought. Then he looked at that single word and thought about what she had actually asked, which was not the same as what he had answered. He wrote below it, "That is a rancher's answer. What I am actually afraid of is waking up one morning and realizing I have grown so accustomed to being alone that I no longer recognize it as a lack, that the quiet has become the only thing I know how to hear." He was not certain why he told her that. He told her anyway. Her reply to that one came in 8 days, the fastest she had written. The letter was shorter than usual. Most of it was practical, a question about the nearest town, a question about winter temperatures. But near the end, standing alone in the middle of the page, with space above and below it, as though she had written it, and then considered removing it, and then decided to leave it. I am afraid of the same thing. That is why I am no longer willing to wait. He read that sentence until the paper softened at the fold. It was on a Thursday evening in late October that Theo came into the kitchen and found Everett at the table with a letter in his hand, and stopped in the doorway the way Theo always stopped in doorways, as though he needed to evaluate whether the room was safe to enter. "What are you doing?" "Reading." Theo looked at the envelope on the table. He was 19 years old and still had the young man's habit of looking at everything with an expression that suggested mild suspicion. He had their father's coloring and their mother's way of holding his jaw slightly forward when he was thinking, which gave him an air of permanent low-level disagreement. "Is that from the service Delia set you up with?" "It is." Theo sat down in the other chair. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You know Ruth wouldn't have wanted you sitting alone in here forever." Everett folded the letter and set it on the table. "I know that. So why did you—" Everett was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind picked up and set something loose on the roof rattling. Because knowing something and being able to do something about it are 2 different problems. Theo considered that. He seemed to find it unsatisfying the way 19-year-olds tend to find answers that don't resolve neatly. But he didn't push further. Instead, he stayed at the table, which he didn't usually do in the evenings. He was generally in his bunk by this hour, reading or writing letters of his own. Though Everett hadn't asked him about the letters because it hadn't seemed like his business yet. They sat together for a while without talking. The lamp was between them and the wind was outside, and the house had the particular quality of quiet that it got in the late evenings of late October, when the last of the warmth had gone out of the day and not yet gone out of the walls. It was the easiest they had sat together in some time. Before he left for his bunk, Theo stopped at the door. He was quiet for a moment, his hand on the frame. Then he went out. Everett watched him go. Then he looked at the table, at the lamp, at the letter still folded there. He had not quite registered it until just then, but Theo had been holding something under his arm when he sat down, an envelope already opened that he'd taken with him when he left. He had held it the whole time they were sitting there, without mentioning it. Everett thought about that for a moment. Then he turned the lamp down and went to bed. The fifth letter arrived on a cold morning in the first week of November, and it was different from the others in a way Everett recognized before he could have explained what he was recognizing. The other letters had been answered from a considered distance. This one was closer. Not warmer exactly, she wasn't a warm writer, which he had come to appreciate about her, but closer. The distance had been reduced by some increment he couldn't quite measure. She asked him, "What do you want from this?" Not from the arrangement. From this specifically, from writing to someone you haven't met. He spent most of a morning thinking about that. He was mending fence on the north section when the question arrived in his head, and he stopped with the wire stretched between his hands and stood there in the cold. For long enough that one of the horses in the near pasture came over to investigate whether he was dead. He went back to the house that afternoon and wrote, "I want someone who will tell me when I am wrong about something and expect me to take it seriously. I want someone who has an honest opinion of her own circumstances and is not in the habit of adjusting it to make other people comfortable. I want to sit down to a meal and have it matter to two people instead of one." He looked at what he had written. He had not intended to say that much. He had not intended to say any of it. He wrote it into the envelope quickly before the part of him that was careful could catch up to the part of him that was honest. Her answer came 10 days later. It was the longest letter she had written, 3 full pages, which was unusual for her, and in it she talked about Cincinnati, about her uncle who had taught her the printing trade before he died, about the years of working for men who underestimated her until they needed something calculated and then suddenly did not. About a winter when she had stayed in a boarding house with 6 other women and a landlady who charged by the candle, and about what that winter had taught her about being careful with what was important and careless with what wasn't. And at the very end, standing apart from everything else the way the previous important sentence had stood apart. I have not been willing to wait any longer. That is not a new feeling. What is new is that I have found in these letters someone worth not waiting for. He read that line 4 times. Then he got up from the table and went outside and stood in the cold for a while, looking at the ridge above the property as it caught the last of the afternoon light. The cattle were quiet. The wind had died down to almost nothing. The sky in the west was going the color of old copper. Delia Marsh had put a piece of paper on his counter 3 months ago and called it encouragement. He had taken it home and done nothing with it for 2 weeks. And then on a windy night when the house was too quiet and he was too tired to lie to himself, he had written to a stranger. He was not certain that was the same as believing the thing would come to anything. But there was a letter in the house from a woman in Cincinnati who wrote with a deliberate hand and asked honest questions. and did not soften her conclusions to make them easier to receive. And for the first time in 4 years, Everett Crail had something he was looking forward to. Not the resolution of it, just the next letter, the continuation of something that had not yet become clear enough to be afraid of. He went back inside. The box under the bed had 6 letters in it now, 7, counting the new one. He put the lamp on and began to write back. The train from Cincinnati to Cheyenne took 4 days, with a change at Chicago, and another at Omaha, and Cordelia Voss spent most of it doing arithmetic, not the kind she was trained for, not ledgers and loss columns, and the careful accounting of what was owed against what was available. This was a different kind of calculation, the kind that runs in the back of a person's mind when they are making a decision they cannot fully explain and are trying to find the rational frame that makes it hold still. $340, due no later than the 15th of March, which was 5 months and some days from now. The attorney representing the creditor in Pittsburgh had been patient about it. Patient in the way that men with legal standing tend to be patient, which is to say without urgency and without mercy. Patient in the manner of someone who has all the time in the world, because time is working in their favor. Regardless, she had received the most recent letter at her boarding house in Cincinnati 3 weeks before she had written to the correspondence service, and she had read it twice and then set it in the drawer where she kept the things she needed to deal with and could not yet deal with. And then she had gone to the window and stood there for a long time, looking at the street below. $340 was not in the abstract an impossible sum. She had earned more than that in a single year, more than once. But abstract arithmetic and actual arithmetic were 2 different problems, and the actual arithmetic was this: the last printing operation had closed 14 months ago. And the work she had done since then, bookkeeping for a dry goods merchant, 2 months of invoicing for a furniture importer, a brief and unhappy engagement with a shipping company whose owner believed that women who did numbers were an experiment he was willing to try but not willing to pay properly for, had kept her adequately fed and inadequately solvent. She had no savings that mattered. She had no family who could absorb the shortfall. She had in a drawer in a Cincinnati boarding house a legal notice and a developing understanding of what it meant. What it meant was that she needed a legal address that was not Cincinnati. She needed standing in a place where the attorney in Pittsburgh would have to follow her instead of simply walking across town. She needed time, and time required distance, and distance required a reason. The correspondence service had given her a reason. This was what she told herself on the train, and it was true. And she knew it was not the whole truth. And the distance between those 2 things was what the arithmetic kept circling back to without resolving. Because there was the letter he had written about being afraid of growing accustomed to being alone. There was the letter about wanting someone who would tell him when he was wrong and expect to be taken seriously. There were 8 letters total, and in none of them had Everett Crail said a single thing she did not believe. She had answered honestly. That was the part she kept returning to. Every question she had answered as honestly as she knew how. Every observation she had made because it was true. She had not invented a version of herself better suited to the situation. She had written as herself entirely with one omission. The omission was not small. She watched the plains of Nebraska give way to the high grasslands of Wyoming and did not let herself complete the thought that was forming, the one that asked what kind of foundation 8 honest letters could be if the ninth left out $340 and the specific gravity of why she had said yes. The train pulled into Cheyenne in the early afternoon. She changed trains there, waiting 2 hours on a platform that smelled of coal smoke and early winter, then rode the spur line north toward Harrow Flat as the light changed and the country opened into something she had not expected. Not dramatic, not the imposing scenery she had read about in the accounts of Western travel. Just wide, wider than anything she had a reference for. The sky was the kind of blue that made distance seem like a physical substance, and the ridge to the east caught the lowering sun and held it for a long time after the valley below had gone into shadow. She stepped off the train with one bag, which was the right size for someone who knew what they needed and did not carry extra. The first person she met in Harrow Flat was not Everett Crail. Delia Marsh was standing in front of her post office and general store for reasons that had nothing to do with Cordelia Voss. She was waiting for a delivery of lamp oil that was running 3 days late and had developed the habit of watching the road when she was irritated. She saw the train come in and saw the passengers step off and sorted them by eye, the way she sorted mail quickly, accurately, without sentiment. The woman with the single bag and the measured step was new to Harrow Flat. That was not unusual. What was unusual was the way she stood on the platform after stepping down, not looking around with the disorientation of someone arriving somewhere unfamiliar, but standing still for a moment and taking in the particular quality of the air, the light, the particular silence of a small town in the hour before supper, as though she were calibrating something. Delia crossed the road. "You're the woman who's been writing to Everett Crail." The woman looked at her. She had gray eyes and a face that was not beautiful in the way that required admiration, but that held attention without apparent effort. "I'm C. Voss," she said. "Cordelia. Delia Marsh. I know most things that happen here, and the things that aren't my business I tend to find out about anyway." She looked at the bag. "He's not here. He didn't know the exact hour. I didn't give him the exact hour." "No," Delia said. "I gathered that from the fact that he's not here." She studied Cordelia Voss for a moment longer. "I can send someone out to the spread, or I can take you myself. It's not far. You want to look at me before he does." Delia did not deny it. "I want to know he's not making a mistake. And you'll determine that by looking at me." "No," she said, "by listening to you talk." Cordelia Voss looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her bag. "Then we should go before I think too hard about what that means." The road to the Crail spread ran northeast from town, along a creek that had not yet frozen past a stand of cottonwood that had gone entirely gold and was beginning to let it go. The afternoon was cold and clear, and the horse moved at a steady pace that Delia did not hurry. She asked practical questions on the way: how the train had been, whether Cordelia had eaten, whether she had ever been west of Ohio before. Cordelia answered practically. She had been to Chicago twice. The train had been unremarkable. She had eaten adequately, which was the most that could be said for train food. "What did you think of it?" Delia asked. "The country." Cordelia looked out at the ridge. "I thought it was wider than I expected. Not more dramatic, just wider. Most people say dramatic. Most people haven't done the arithmetic on how long it would take to walk across it. Delia said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "You'll do all right?" Cordelia looked at her. "You've decided that quickly. I've been watching people for 60 years. I get to decide quickly." They came over a low rise, and the Crail property came into view below a house that was plainly but solidly built, a barn that showed recent repair on the south face, a water trough, a corral with 4 horses in it, and a section of fence along the near pasture that had a man working on it with his back to the road. Delia brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the property, rather than driving through the gate. "I'll let you walk in from here." Cordelia looked at her. "He doesn't need an audience," Delia said. "And neither do you." The grass was dry underfoot, and the cold had that particular Western quality of being direct rather than damp. And Cordelia walked the 100 yards from the wagon to the fence, with her bag in her hand, and her breath making small clouds in the still air. The man working the fence had not heard her yet. He was running new wire along a section where the old had come loose from the post, working with the focused efficiency of someone who had done this particular task many times and had no patience for doing it twice. She stopped about 10 feet away. "Mr. Crail." He turned. She had expected, she wasn't certain what she had expected. 8 letters gave you the outline of a person. They gave you the shape of a mind. They did not give you the specific way a man turned when surprised, or the precise quality of attention in his eyes when he first looked at you. He looked at her the way she had imagined he might look at a change in weather, steadily with full attention, without alarm. "Miss Voss," he said. "Cordelia." She set down her bag. "I prefer Cordelia." He nodded once. "The train was late." "The train was late," she confirmed. He looked at her for another moment with that same steady quality. She looked back at him. They were both, she understood, adjusting, comparing the person they had constructed from language against the person standing in the cold air of a November afternoon. "Have you eaten?" he said. "Not since Cheyenne." "I can do better than whatever you had in Cheyenne." "That's a low standard," she said. Cheyenne was not impressive. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the structural possibility of one. He reached down and picked up his tools and wire from the ground. "Delia brought you out. She was very thorough about evaluating me on the way." "What did she decide?" "She said I'd do all right. I'm not certain I've been more briefly assessed." "She's usually right," he said. "That's the irritating part." He gestured toward the house, and she picked up her bag, and they walked across the dry grass in the last of the afternoon light. The arrangement was simple and stated plainly over the first meal, which he made without ceremony, and which was considerably better than Cheyenne. She would take the room at the east end of the house, which had its own lamp and a window that faced the ridge. His brother Theo would move to the room above the barn, which Theo had already been informed of, and had registered with less complaint than Everett had anticipated. They would have 1 month. If at the end of that month both of them wished to continue, they would go to the territorial seat and make it legal. If either of them did not, then she would have 2 weeks, and whatever he could put together in the way of travel money, and no one would be owed an explanation. She had agreed to those terms without negotiating them. He had not expected her to negotiate them. but he had respected the fact that she listened to all of them before agreeing. The first 2 weeks were not what Everett had expected, which he understood meant he had been expecting something specific without realizing it. He had expected the friction of proximity to adults who had lived alone too long, learning to share a kitchen and a schedule. That friction was present. But underneath it was something else, the specific discovery that the person he had been writing to was in the actual world the same person. Not in the way of someone performing consistency. In the way of someone who simply was the same thing throughout, the way a fence post driven all the way down is the same wood above the ground as below it. She reorganized his filing system on the 3rd day without asking him. He came in from the south pasture to find his 3 years of supply invoices sorted by vendor and cross-referenced by date in a way that would have taken him a week to construct, and that he understood immediately upon seeing it. She had left a note on top. Your supplier for hay has been charging you 12% above the standard rate for 2 years. I've written the calculation on the back of this page. You should write to them. He turned the page over. She had written the calculation in the same careful hand as the letters with a note at the bottom. If they dispute it, the math is straightforward, and I can put it in a form a lawyer could use. He left the pages on the kitchen table at dinner and said, I need to write to the hay supplier. She looked up. I know. Thank you. She nodded and went back to her meal, and that was the end of it. On the 5th day, he noticed that her lamp was on past midnight. Not for the first time. He had heard it through the wall. Not the light, but the small sounds of a person awake and working in the adjacent room, the occasional shift of weight, the turning of pages. The next morning, without comment, he left a better lamp on the kitchen table with a note that said, This one doesn't need trimming as often. He did not explain how he had known she needed it. She did not ask. In the 2nd week, she watched him work, not hovering, just present in the way of someone building a catalog. She watched how he decided which tasks to do in what order. She watched which things he fixed once and never needed to fix again, and which things he allowed to be good enough rather than right. She was making some kind of assessment he understood, and he did not mind being assessed. He had nothing to hide from an honest look. Theo tried to cook supper one evening in what he described as an attempt to be useful. The result was a soup that had committed some fundamental error at the level of its own conception. Cordelia came into the kitchen, looked at the pot for 3 seconds, and began a quiet series of interventions that salvaged it into something that was, if not good, at least honest about what it was. Theo stood to the side watching her work with the expression of a man observing a natural phenomenon. She fixed it, I said to Everett at the table. She fixed the stove too, Everett said. The draft was wrong. Theo looked at Cordelia. Are you going to fix everything? She considered the question seriously. Not everything, just the things that are worth fixing. Theo looked at his brother. Everett ate his soup. There was a night in the middle of the 2nd week when Everett found Theo standing at the kitchen window at close to midnight, looking out at nothing in particular. Everett had come down for water and stood for a moment in the doorway before Theo heard him. He sat down at the table. Theo stayed at the window. After a while, Theo said, Do you ever regret staying here? Everett thought about that the way he thought about things worth thinking about. which was to say without rushing toward an answer. "No," he said finally, "but I've wondered sometimes who I would have been if I'd gone. What's the difference? Regret is about the past. Wondering is about what's still open." He looked at the table. "I can't do anything with the past." Theo was quiet for a long time. The wind had come up outside and was moving through the cottonwoods along the creek with the particular sound that wind in cottonwoods makes in November, which is less like wind than like water. "I've been writing to a company in Denver," Theo said. "A railroad company. They have accounting work." Everett nodded. "You knew—" "I had a general impression. I didn't know the specifics." Theo turned from the window. "You're not angry." "Should I be? You need someone on the property." "I need someone on the property who wants to be there," Everett said. "That's different." He looked at his brother. "Do you want to be here?" Theo looked at the window, at the dark, at whatever he was actually looking at. That had nothing to do with the window or the dark. "I don't know how to tell the difference between wanting to stay and being afraid to go." "That's the only honest answer," Everett said. "When you know which one it is, tell me." Theo nodded. He looked like a young man carrying something he had been carrying for long enough that he'd forgotten it was heavy, and the forgetting was the most exhausting part. Everett got his water and went back to bed and left Theo to the window. The man came to Harrow Flat on a Wednesday in the third week of November. Delia saw him first, which was how things generally went in Harrow Flat. He came in on the afternoon stage, not the train which told her he had come from the south, not the east, and he asked at her counter whether there was a Cordelia Voss staying in the area. He was not aggressive about it. He was the kind of man who was worse than aggressive, neat patient carrying a document case with the manner of someone who did not need to hurry because the calendar was doing his work for him. She told him she would inquire. She did not tell him where to look. She drove out to the Crail spread that afternoon. Cordelia was in the yard splitting kindling, which she had apparently decided was a reasonable thing to do without being asked. And Delia pulled the wagon up and waited until Cordelia looked up. "There's a man in town," Delia said. "He asked for you by name. He's a lawyer. He has a case full of papers." Cordelia set the hatchet down against the woodpile. Her face did not change much. It changed enough. "Thank you," she said. "Do you want to tell me no?" Delia sat for a moment. "Cordelia, I don't know your situation. I know Everett Crail, and I know that man does not judge people for what he doesn't know, but he will for what he isn't told." Cordelia looked at her for a long moment. Her jaw was set in the way of someone who has been arguing with themselves about something for long enough that the argument has become a kind of exhaustion. Then she said, "I know that." Delia picked up the reins. "Good," she said. "Then you know what to do." She drove back to town and did not offer any further advice because advice in her experience was most useful when it was short enough to remember and quiet enough to let the person hearing it make it their own. Cordelia found Everett in the barn that evening mending a harness that had cracked along the shoulder strap. She stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "I need to tell you something," she said. "I should have told you before now." He kept his hands on the harness but looked up at her. He waited, which was what he did. She told him about her uncle. Not the whole history, She did not have the luxury of the whole history right now, and she understood that the shape of it mattered more than the details. Her uncle had taught her the trade. He had taken in a 15-year-old girl with no other family and given her work and a reason to develop her particular gifts. And she had loved him in the practical way that the practically minded love people who give them useful things rather than sentimental ones. 3 years before he died, he had needed to guarantee a lease on new equipment, a press, a binder, the kind of machinery that would have let the operation survive another decade. The bank had wanted a co-signer. He would not ask. She had arranged it without telling him, knowing he would refuse it if she asked. He had died 14 months later. The operation had not survived him by more than 6 months. The creditor had come to her because her name was on the paper. $340, she said, due in March. A lawyer had arrived in Harrow Flat today. Everett set the harness down on the workbench. She continued. She told him the rest of it, not all of it at once, not smoothly, but directly the way she did most things. That she had needed a legal address outside Cincinnati. That the correspondence service had offered a solution to a practical problem, at the same time that it had offered something else. Something she did not have a clean word for, and that she had not been able to separate those two things in her mind clearly enough to know which one came first. The letters were honest, she said. Every word, except that I never mentioned this. He was quiet for a long moment. The barn was warm enough from the horses and the stored hay, and the lamp at the far end threw enough light to see by without being bright. The man you signed for, he said. What did you call him? She didn't understand the question immediately. What did I call him? Did you call him by his first name or did you call him something else? Uncle Walter, she said, and her voice went slightly strange on it. He nodded slowly. How long before he died did you sign 6 months? Did he know? No. I knew he needed it, and I knew he wouldn't accept it if I asked. Everett stood up from the workbench and walked to the barn door and stood looking out into the dark for a while. She waited. He turned back. You didn't come here because you were cornered, he said. You came here because you had used every kinder option first. Everett, I'm not saying it to be kind, he said, and his voice was level. I'm saying it because that's what I see. He looked at her steadily. $340 is how much of what you earned in 12 years. Enough to lose everything if I don't settle it. And now, she understood the question. Now I have an address in Wyoming. Then respond to them from an address in Wyoming, he said. I have a lawyer in the territorial seat. He's not brilliant, but he reads a contract carefully. He turned back to the harness on the workbench and picked it up. His name is Aldous Fenn. I'll write to him tonight. She stood in the doorway, watching him. You're not going to ask me why I didn't say this sooner. I know why. He didn't look up from the stitching. Because you weren't certain how I'd take it. And you're taking it this way because... He stopped stitching and looked at her directly. Because in 3 weeks you haven't done a single thing I couldn't account for. Except this. And now you've done this. He held her gaze. That's enough for me to work with. She stood there for a moment longer. Then she said, I'll leave you to the harness. She went back to the house. She sat at the kitchen table and did not do arithmetic for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember. Outside, the wind came down off the ridge and moved through the property the way wind did here, without apology and without particular destination. She had not expected Wyoming to sound the way it sounded. She had not expected a great many things. The 3 days that followed were quiet in a way that had texture to it. Neither of them referred to what had been said in the barn. This was not avoidance. She had been around enough avoidance to know what it looked like, and this was not that. It was more that the conversation had done what it was supposed to do and didn't need to be done again. And they were both people who understood that. They moved through the days of the property the way two people move through a space they have agreed to share. With consideration, with occasional collision, with the gradual accumulation of small knowledge. She noticed that he always checked the water trough last before coming in for the evening, and that if there was something wrong with it, he would fix it then, rather than leave it for morning, even if fixing it made him late for supper. He kept the Bible his mother had given him on the shelf above his bed. Not a worn Bible, which meant he kept it for reasons that were not devotional, and she did not ask about those reasons. He noticed that she read in the evenings with the focused quiet that she brought to everything, but that the books she chose were practical, rather than diverting law, surveying land tenure, and that she read them the way she read contracts, hunting the specific sentence that would be useful later. He noticed that she had strong opinions about coffee, but expressed them only through action, rather than comment, which meant that his coffee had improved dramatically and without discussion. On the morning of the 4th day, Everett rode south to the territorial seat without telling Cordelia where he was going. He found the lawyer representing the Pittsburgh creditor at the only hotel in Millhaven, a patient man named Garrett, who was exactly as Cordelia had described. Unhurried, organized holding documents that were entirely in order. Everett explained that he was writing on behalf of Cordelia Voss, who was now resident at his property outside Harrow Flat, and whose legal circumstances had accordingly changed. He offered $200 in cash, nearly everything he kept for winter contingencies, as a temporary bond against the debt sufficient to suspend any collection action, while the underlying contract was reviewed by a local attorney. Garrett looked at the money and then at Everett and asked what his interest in the matter was. "She's going to be my wife," Everett said. It was the first time he had said that out loud, and it sounded in the small hotel room more certain than he had fully realized he was. "Her debts are my business." Garrett accepted the bond. He was a lawyer, not a debt collector, and the bond was clean and the paperwork was orderly, and that was sufficient. Everett rode back to Harrow Flat and said nothing about where he had been. Delia Marsh saw him coming back from the south. She knew the direction of the territorial seat. She drove out to the Crail property the next morning and found Cordelia at the woodpile again. "He went to Millhaven yesterday," Delia said. Cordelia set down the hatchet slowly. "He put money against your debt," Delia said. "He didn't ask me not to tell you. He probably didn't think about whether I'd know." Cordelia stood with her hand on the woodpile for a moment. Her face went through something that Delia did not try to name. "Thank you," Cordelia said. "You should talk to him," Delia said, and drove back to town. She found him at the near pasture fence at the end of the afternoon doing the same kind of work he had been doing when she arrived. The fence always seemed to need something less, because it was poorly made and more because the land and the weather were persistent about testing it. "You went to Mill Haven," she said. "He kept his hands on the wire." "I did." "You put money against it. Winter money. There are 2 months before I need it. Fenn will have read the contract by then. You didn't ask me." He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "No," he said. "I didn't. You didn't ask me because you knew I'd say no." "Yes. You didn't have the right to make that decision." "I know," he said. He didn't offer anything further. She stood there looking at him. The late light was behind her, and in his face, and he met it directly, without squinting the way he met most things. "Then why?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which she had come to understand was what he did instead of answering quickly. "Because I could die," he said finally. "And because for once I did not want to stand to the side and watch what happened." She was quiet for a long time. The horses in the pasture moved slowly in the far corner. The light was going out of the sky at the edge of the ridge. "Aldous Fenn," she said. "He's in the territorial seat. He's not the best lawyer in Wyoming, but he's thorough. I want to look at the contract myself before he does." "I expected that," Everett said. "I'll write to him tonight." She looked at him for another moment. Then she turned and walked back toward the house without saying anything else. He watched her go. Then he turned back to the fence. The wire was cold in his hands, and the light was nearly gone. And somewhere below the ridge, a pair of coyotes had started up their voices, carrying in that clean highway that coyote voices carried in the open country at nightfall. He finished the section he was on, and gathered his tools and walked back toward the house where the lamp was on in the kitchen, and the smell of something cooking had reached him halfway across the yard. He stood at the door for a moment before going in. It was the kind of moment that didn't announce itself as significant. He understood that it might be, and he let that understanding sit without doing anything with it. And then he opened the door and went inside. The letter from Aldous Fenn arrived on a Thursday morning 11 days after Everett had written to him. Fenn was not a man who wasted paper. His letters ran to the point with the efficiency of someone who billed by the hour, and had learned that clients did not want to pay for preamble. This one was 4 paragraphs. Cordelia read it standing at the kitchen table, still in her coat from having taken it from Delia's counter herself that morning. She read it twice. Then she sat down. The guarantee contract she had signed for her uncle contained a clause-standard language. Fenn wrote the kind of language that got inserted into commercial documents routinely, and then forgotten by both parties, that voided the guarantor's obligation in the event of the principal debtor's death prior to the first scheduled payment. Her uncle Walter had died 14 months before the lease's first payment came due. The clause was unambiguous. The creditor's attorney either had not read it or had assumed she hadn't. $340. 3 years of carrying it. Because she could not afford to pay a lawyer to read 12 pages of contract language. She sat with that for a long time. When Everett came in from the morning's work, she was still at the table. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it standing up, read it again, set it down. "Fenn's sure," he said. "He says the language is unambiguous." He nodded. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He looked at her face and did not look away from what he saw there. which she appreciated. She had no patience for people who looked away from inconvenient expressions. 3 years, she said. Yes. Because I didn't have $40 to pay someone to read it. He didn't try to find the useful side of that. He just said, yes, again, and let it be what it was, a specific and undecorated injustice, the kind that did not benefit from being reframed. After a while, she said, I need to write to Garrett. Fen will do it. That's what he's for. She looked at the letter again. Your $200. Fen will recover it as part of the resolution. It was a clean bond. He paused. You can look at the paperwork if you want. I will, she said. Later, she folded Fen's letter along its crease and set it on the table between them. Outside, the wind had come up, the early December kind that carried actual winter in it, rather than just the suggestion of winter. The kitchen was warm. The lamp on the shelf behind her was the good one, the one he had left without explanation 3 weeks ago. Thank you, she said. Not for the money specifically. Not for Fen. For the particular way he had done it. Not as rescue. Not as the exercise of authority over her situation, but as the act of a person who had decided that her problems were problems he was willing to have alongside her. He accepted it without deflecting it. You're welcome, he said simply. And that was exactly right. That evening, she found Theo in the barn, ostensibly checking on the horses, but actually she had come to understand using the barn as the place he went when something was working itself out in his head. She had her own version of this, the woodpile, the east window at night, and she recognized the behavior for what it was. She did not pretend she had come for any other reason. Have you heard back from Denver? She asked. He looked at her. Then 2 days ago. And they want me to start in February. He was quiet for a moment, running his hand along the near horse's flank without looking at it. Accounting work on the northern line. It's good money. Better than here. Better than I'd make here in 5 years. He stopped. That's not the reason. I know it's not. She leaned against the stall door. What did Everett say? I haven't told him yet. Theo. I know. He looked at the horse. I know I have to. She was quiet for a moment. Can I tell you something that isn't my business to tell you? He looked up. Your brother does not need you to stay, she said. That's not the same as saying he won't miss you. He'll miss you considerably. But needing and missing are different things. And he knows the difference, and he would not want you to confuse them on his behalf. Theo looked at her for a long moment. He was 19 years old and had been carrying a decision he thought would cost his brother something. And the weight of that had made the decision itself harder to see clearly. He already knows, Theo said slowly. Doesn't he? He had a general impression, she said. His words. Theo laughed short, somewhat relieved. That sounds exactly like him. Go talk to him, she said. Tonight. Not because he needs to know, but because you need to have said it. She left him there and went back to the house. Everett was at the table with his account book open, which was where he usually was at this hour. She sat across from him and opened the book she had been reading, Land Tenure Law, Wyoming Territory, and they sat together in the lamplight without speaking. And it was not a silence that needed filling. An hour later, Theo came in from the barn and sat down at the table and put a letter on the wood between himself and his brother. Everett looked at it. Then he looked at Theo. He picked up the letter and read it, and she watched his face while he did, and she saw what was there, which was not surprise, and was not anger, and was not simple acceptance either. It was the more complicated thing, the thing that looks like steadiness, but is actually steadiness being chosen actively in the moment. He set the letter down. "The pay is good," he said. Theo nodded. "February is enough time to find someone seasonal for the spring work." "I thought so too." Everett looked at the letter again. "Denver's not far." "No," Theo said. "It's not far." They looked at each other across the table. She returned to her book and gave them what privacy two people can have in a single room, which is not much, but is sometimes sufficient. December came in properly with snow on the ridge and ice on the creek in the mornings, and the particular quality of light that the high Wyoming winter produced, pale and exact and enormously clear, as though the cold had purified the air of everything that was not essential. The days shortened. The work contracted with them turning inward the way winter work did, closer to the buildings, more repetitive, requiring patience more than strength. Aldous Fenn wrote again to confirm that the guarantee obligation had been formally voided, and that the bond payment had been recovered and would be returned by bank draft within the week. The letter from Garrett, the Pittsburgh attorney, arrived 4 days later. Terse, professionally gracious, entirely without apology. She filed it in the wooden box under her bed, which had acquired a small collection of documents over the past weeks, and thought no more about Pittsburgh. She thought about other things instead, the way the property worked, which was with a logic she had been assembling gradually, which pastures the cattle preferred, in which weather why the well on the north side never froze despite the exposure. She had begun keeping a secondary ledger without being asked, tracking patterns across the previous 3 years of accounts that Everett kept accurately but without analysis. She left it on the table one morning without comment. He read it that evening and came to find her at the east window. "You found the feed margin," he said. "It's been there for 2 years. I knew the number was off. I didn't know how to find where." "The hay supplier wasn't the only one," she said. "The grain merchant in Millhaven has been rounding up on the weight, not by much, enough to matter across a year." He looked at her. "How long did it take you to find that?" "An afternoon." He nodded slowly. "Write to the grain merchant," he said. "I'll sign the letter." "I thought I would," she said, and turned back to the window. It was Delia who raised the practical question, as Delia tended to raise practical questions without ceremony in the middle of something else, as though the matter had simply occurred to her. She came by on the second Saturday of December, ostensibly to drop off a package that had arrived for Everett from the territorial seat, and stayed for coffee, during which time she looked at the two of them with the particular expression she used when she was performing an assessment she had already completed. "Have you two made any sort of formal arrangement?" she asked, directing the question at neither of them specifically. Cordelia looked at Everett. Everett looked at his coffee. "We've discussed going to the territorial seat," he said. "Have you discussed when?" "We have not set a specific date." Delia put her cup down. The roads get difficult in January. If you're going to do it, you should do it before the new year. Cordelia said, "She's right." Everett looked at her. There was a question in his face that was not about the roads or the new year. She held his gaze. "She's right," she said again. He looked back at his coffee. Then he nodded. "We'll go Wednesday." "Good," Delia said. She picked up her cup. "I'll need to come as a witness." "I hadn't asked you yet," Everett said. "I know," she said. "I'm asking myself. You'll want someone there who won't forget the details." They rode to the territorial seat on a Wednesday morning that was clear and very cold, the three of them in the wagon with lap blankets and a stone-warmed brick that Theo had contributed without being asked. He had also polished his boots, which Cordelia noticed and did not mention. The territorial courthouse was a two-story building on the main street of Millhaven, built with the determined solidity of institutions that want to communicate permanence in places that have not yet entirely earned it. The judge who handled civil matters was named Orville Maas, and he had been handling them for long enough that he conducted the business without theater, checked their documents, confirmed their names, asked the required questions. He asked Everett first. Everett said yes without pause or decoration. He asked Cordelia. She looked at Everett for a moment before answering, not because she was uncertain, because she wanted to be looking at him when she said it. Not at the judge, not at the documents, not at the institutional weight of the room. At him. She said yes, and she said it to him, and he understood that. And his expression did something that she would not have been able to describe to anyone but would not forget. Maas had them sign the papers. He signed his own. He congratulated them in the efficient manner of a man who had done this more times than he kept count of, and had respect for the institution, without requiring the participants to perform enthusiasm. Delia signed as witness. She did not cry, or at least she gave no outward indication of crying. She signed her name in her large, clear hand and said, "There, that's done correctly." Theo, standing against the wall with his polished boots, had the expression of someone trying to appear casual about something that had moved him. He did not succeed entirely, which was, Cordelia thought, one of the better things about him. They ate at the hotel dining room afterward, a meal that was unremarkable in itself, but that had the quality of all meals taken at the right moment, which is that the food matters less than the occasion. Delia told a story about the first wedding she had witnessed in Harrow Flat in 1861, where the groom had arrived with a broken arm from a horse that had disagreed with the plan, and the ceremony had proceeded anyway. Theo asked questions about Denver that no one could answer definitively. Everett ate steadily and said little, which was his way, but he was present in a way that she had come to distinguish from the way he was sometimes absent while still being in the room, a distinction that had taken her a while to identify, and that she now thought was one of the more important things she had learned about him. On the ride back, the sun had gone behind the ridge, and the cold had deepened into the true cold of a Wyoming December afternoon, the kind that required no wind to make its point. Cordelia had the lap blanket, and Delia had the other end of it, and Theo was in the back managing with his coat and his youth. Everett drove. After a long quiet, Delia said to no one in particular, in the tone of someone completing a thought they had been having for some time, "Least theatrical wedding I've witnessed in 30 years. "Is that a criticism?" Everett asked. "No," she said. "It's an observation." She pulled the blanket up slightly. The theatrical ones are usually the ones that need the theater. No one had anything to add to that. The wagon moved through the pale winter afternoon, and the ridge held its snow above them. And the town of Harrow Flat appeared eventually below the slope, its windows beginning to show lamplight in the early dark. Theo left for Denver on the first Friday of the new year, which was 1890. He was up before dawn, packing the last of his things, moving through the house with the careful quiet of someone trying not to wake people, while also, she suspected, not entirely wanting to leave without seeing them. She had been awake since before he was. She was often awake at that hour. And she came out of the kitchen when she heard him in the hallway. He stopped when he saw her. He had his bag in one hand and his coat over his arm, and he looked in the lamplight younger than he usually looked, which was saying something. "You didn't have to get up," he said. "I was already up." He set his bag down. He looked at her with the direct look that he shared with his brother, the family resemblance most visible in that the way they both looked at things they wanted to understand clearly. "Is he going to be all right?" Theo asked. "Yes," she said. "He's going to be fine. I know he's fine. I mean..." He stopped. "Is he going to be all right?" She understood the distinction. "Yes," she said. "I think so." Theo nodded. He picked up his bag. She had put together a package for him the night before, food for the journey. A notebook she thought he would use, a short letter of professional introduction. She had written to a contact she retained from her Cincinnati years, who now worked in the Denver accounting community. A man named Ellsworth, who had been helpful to her once when she had needed it, and who she suspected would be helpful again. She handed the package to Theo. He looked at it. "What's this?" "Open it on the train," she said. "Not before." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "He wrote to you for 8 months before you came." "Closer to 4, she said. "But yes, he never does anything for 8 months unless he's sure of it." 4 months, she said again, but she was not really correcting him. Theo put the package in his bag. He looked like he wanted to say something more and was not certain it would come out right, which she had observed was a Crail family trait, the awareness that words were precise instruments and the reluctance to use them imprecisely. She saved him the difficulty. "Write when you get there," she said, "and write to him, not just to me. He'll want to hear it from you." Theo nodded. He went out into the dark and cold of the January morning, his boots loud on the frozen ground, and then quiet on the road, and then she couldn't hear him anymore. She stood in the kitchen for a while. Then she started the stove for the morning. Whenever it came down an hour later, the coffee was made and she was at the table with her ledger open. He looked at the table, at the chair where Theo usually sat at the window. He poured himself coffee. He sat down. She did not say anything consoling because he was not the kind of man who benefited from consolation at the expense of accuracy. He missed his brother. He would continue to miss him. Those were true things, and they did not need to be softened. After a while, she said, "He took the introduction letter." Everett looked at her. "What introduction letter?" "I wrote to someone I know in Denver's accounting community. He should have a contact when he arrives." Everett held his coffee cup and looked at her. "When did you do that? Yesterday evening?" He looked at the table. Something moved across his face that was not exactly gratitude and not exactly something else. It was in the space between where the things are that people feel when someone has done the right thing, without being asked and without requiring acknowledgement. He nodded once. They drank their coffee in the January morning in the house that was quieter than it had been 2 hours ago, and let the quiet be what it was. The letter from Theo came 3 weeks after he left. It was addressed to both of them. He had arrived without difficulty. The work was more complex than he had expected, which he wrote about with the specific pleasure of someone discovering that a challenge is real rather than imagined. He had found a boarding house run by a widow who fed her tenants adequately and asked no unnecessary questions. He had met Cordelia's contact, and Ellsworth had been unexpectedly generous with his time, had already introduced him to 2 colleagues who might prove useful. The letter was 4 pages. At the end, before his signature, he had written, "Tell Everett the eastern fence on the north section will need attention before April. I noticed it in December and forgot to say." Everett read that line and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "He noticed it in December. Apparently, that section's been soft since October. You should probably get to it before the ground thaws." He folded the letter and set it down. He looked at the window and the winter light coming through it, and she could see him thinking about the fence in the particular focused way he thought about work that needed doing, and underneath that, running alongside it, the other thing, the 4 pages from his brother about a boarding house in Denver and a contact named Ellsworth and the specific pleasure of a real challenge. "He sounds good," Everett said. "He does." He picked up the letter again and read it once more from the beginning, not quickly. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did in that country, reluctantly and not all at once, and with the persistent sense that winter reserved the right to return without notice. The creek unfroze from the center outward, taking most of March to complete the process. The cattle moved to the south pasture. The fence on the north section was attended to in February before the ground softened and held without complaint. She found the issue with the grain merchants' weights in March, confirmed it in April, with a third-party measurement at the mill in Mill Haven, and wrote a letter that was 3 paragraphs long and entirely without anger. The merchant wrote back within the week with a corrected ledger and a credit against future orders. She filed his letter and said nothing about it at dinner. Everett found the credit on the next supply order and looked at her across the table. The grain merchant. "The weights were off," she said. "I told you in December. You said you'd write to him. I wrote to him." He looked at the credit line on the invoice. "You didn't mention the resolution." "You noticed it," she said. "That's the resolution." He set the invoice down. The look on his face was the one she had learned to read accurately by now, not quite a smile, and not quite something else occupying the territory between amusement and something more substantial than amusement. One afternoon in April, she was at the creek on the far eastern edge of the property, studying the rock formation along the bank that had caught her attention the previous fall. Everett came across the pasture and found her crouched at the water's edge with her hands in the gravel. "What are you doing?" he said. "Reading," she said without looking up. He crouched beside her. She showed him the seam in the exposed stone, a thin line running at an angle through darker rock, the color of old brass, where the water had polished it. "That's a quartz seam," she said. "That particular shade matters." He looked at it. It looks like a crack. It is a crack. The question is, what's in it? She looked up at the ridge above them. The creek comes from the north slope. You said it runs yellow after heavy rain. Sometimes. I thought it was silt. Sometimes it's silt, she said. Sometimes it's more than silt. She stood and looked at the ridge for a long moment. I want to run a pan on the gravel bar after the next rain. He looked at her, then at the seam, then back at her. Cordelia. I'm not promising anything, she said. I'm saying the signs are worth reading. She picked up a piece of gravel and turned it in her hand. I have read signs before. Where did you learn to do this? He said. Cincinnati has a geological society. They had a lending library. I had Winters. He was quiet for a moment. Then, what would we need? Pans, a pick, patience. She paused. I have the patience. You have the land. He looked at the seam in the rock one more time. He stood up. I'll get the equipment tomorrow, he said, and walked back across the pasture. She stayed at the creek a little longer, looking at the ridge where the light was on it, thinking about the geometry of drainage and the patience of mineral deposits, and the specific pleasure of a problem that was real rather than imagined. The first pan came up with color in it on a Thursday morning in May, after 3 weeks of looking and 2 days of rain. Small, the kind of color that a man looking for obvious signs would have dismissed. She did not dismiss it. She held the pan level in the creek and showed him. He looked at the flecks at the bottom for a long time without speaking. That's it, he said finally. That's it, she said. That's where it starts. It's very small. It's very real, she said. Those are two different things. He looked at her. How real? Real enough to keep looking. She tipped the pan slightly to show him how the color held. Gold doesn't rush. It settles. You read the water, the weight, the bottom of the pan. She set it level again. This is the creek telling us something. Whether it has enough to say depends on what's in the drainage above. He looked up at the ridge with the same focused attention he gave to fences and accounts and letters he wanted to understand properly. When do we go higher? He said. After the snowmelt is finished. The upper drainage will be muddy until June. He nodded. Then, have you done this before, found something real? Once, she said. In Colorado. I was right about the signs and wrong about who owned the mineral rights, which is a lesson I only needed to learn once. You own the mineral rights here, he said. We both do. I know, she said. And she did know, and the knowing of it was still. She found slightly startling not the legal fact of it, but the texture of what it meant to have standing in a place to be part of what that place could become. She handed him the pan and watched him hold it level, the way she had shown him watching the bottom. What do I see? He said. What do you see? He looked at the flecks for a long time. Small, he said. Real. Yes, she said. That's exactly right. The summer proceeded with the work of it, the cattle and the accounts and the fences and the upper drainage, which they reached in June and panned through July. The results confirmed what the lower pan had suggested, not a fortune in a single afternoon, but a deposit consistent and real of the kind that rewarded patient, systematic work over time. She wrote to 2 men she had known in the Colorado years, men who had done this work honestly. Both came in August. Both confirmed what she had said. One of them looked at Everett when he delivered his assessment and said, "Your wife knows rock." He said it the way men say things when they have been surprised into accuracy. "I know," Everett said. They did not extract dramatically. They extracted carefully over months and said nothing in Harrow Flat until they had something definitive to say. And when they did, they chose not to say it loudly. Delia Marsh found out. Delia Marsh always found out and said only, "Good. You needed something going right on that north section." The money came in slowly and was applied slowly. The roof first. Then the barn's south face properly. Then a second team of horses chosen carefully. Then a section of new land to the northwest that she had identified in February as undervalued and had been watching ever since. She wrote to Theo about the gold in October, after the first assay results had been confirmed. His reply contained more exclamation points than anything he had written before, followed by questions about geological methodology. She wrote back with the answers. Everett added a paragraph about the north section fence, which had held through the summer, and about a horse named Fletcher, who had developed an unreasonable attitude toward the water trough. On an evening in late October, almost exactly a year from when she had stepped off the train in Harrow Flat, they sat on the porch as the last of the light went out of the sky above the ridge. The season had the feeling of completion, that October had not an ending but a rounding off everything that had been opened through the summer, settling into a form that could be carried through winter. The porch had a second chair now, which had appeared in February without discussion, and had been there since. She was reading. He was not doing anything, which was what he did in the evenings when the work was finished, and the day had been long enough to justify simply sitting. The lamp between them was the good one, the first one, the one he had left on her table without explanation in November, now on the small table between their chairs. After a while he said, "Were you afraid when you got off the train?" She considered the question honestly because he had asked it honestly. "No," she said. "I was calculating." "What were you calculating?" "Whether I had made the right decision." She turned a page. "I didn't know yet." "When did you know?" She thought about it. "When Delia said I'd do all right, and I believed her." Which surprised me. I don't usually believe assessments that come that quickly. He was quiet for a moment. "What made you believe her?" "Because she wasn't being kind," she said. "She was being accurate. There's a difference, and I know it when I hear it." The wind came down off the ridge in a long, slow movement, the kind that carried winter in it, without quite being winter yet. The cattle were settled in the south pasture. The horses were in. The books were balanced. She read another page. He looked at the ridge. "I should have written sooner," he said. "Not about anything specific, about all of it in the general sense." "You wrote when you were ready," she said without looking up. 4 years is a long time to not be ready. You weren't ready in those 4 years. She turned the page. You were ready when you were ready. The letters were right when they came. He looked at her. She could feel him looking at her, the focused quality of it, and she let him look without putting the book down. "How do you do that?" he said. "Do what?" Make things less heavy than they are, without making them less true. She thought about it. I do accounting, she said. The numbers don't change whether you're frightened of them or not. You might as well look at them directly. He said nothing for a moment. Then, is that what you do with everything? Most things, she said. Not everything. She paused. Some things I'm still working out. She put the book down in her lap and looked out at the ridge where it was going dark against a sky that still held some light, the faint brass color of a late autumn evening at elevation. Below the ridge, the property. Below the property, the creek running in the dark, carrying whatever it carried down from the high ground, slow and patient and consistent. I am glad I came, she said, not performing it, just saying it the way she said things that were simply true. I know, he said. Do you? I can tell, he said, when something is true. She picked up her book. He looked at the ridge. The lamp between them burned steadily in the still evening air, and the light from it reached exactly as far as it needed to and no further.